Venerables, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Joyce Low. On behalf of the Reverend Sang Hui Xia Qi Fa Si of Bao Guang Fo Tang, the organizer, I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for coming to this talk. Reverend Sang Hui Xia Qi would also like to take this opportunity to thank the People Buddhism Studies Society, Amitabha Center, Guanghua Si Buddhist Ambulance, and St. John's Ambulance Brigade, and many others who contributed to this talk in one way or the other for their valuable support. More importantly, our reverends would like to thank Dr. Lei Jiunan, who travels all the way to Singapore to give us this total natural health information. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lei Jiunan. Dr. Lei received a doctorate in chemistry at MIT. She brings with her more than 10 years of cancer research experience at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, which is one of the largest cancer research centers in America. She also conducted research in Beijing under the auspices of the U.S. National Academy of Science. She is the director of the Land of Medicine Buddha, a center for healing and developing a good heart. Dr. Lei advocates natural food, Qigong, thought transformation and purification of mind for cancer prevention and recovery. Therefore, this talk is not about how to avoid dying. It is about how to enjoy living a fuller and healthier life. May I now have the privilege and the pleasure to call upon Dr. Lei to deliver the talk. Let's give Dr. Lei a very big welcome.
I want to express my appreciation again for all the good-hearted people who made it possible for me to be here to meet all of you. And I thank all of you for being here. Before we start tonight, I would like to ask all of you to do a little relaxation exercise with me. I think throughout the talk we will be doing a few little actual practice. So it's not just a theoretical talk. This is actually in some way a continuation of yesterday's talk, but I'll kind of review some of the essential points and then add on some of the things I didn't have a chance to talk about yesterday. So first of all, we will go through a several step of relaxation. So if you first kind of relax your forehead, relax the muscle in your forehead, and relax until it's almost non-existent. As it turns on, when you relax your forehead, your whole body is relaxed. Then relax your eyebrows. When your eyebrows are relaxed, the mind is relaxed. Relax the corners of your mouth. So you have a little smile on your face. That relaxes your emotions. And relax the muscles behind your knees and the heels. When you relax the body, you can feel a greater sense of energy. So you can probably feel some tingling going down all the way to your toes. So as you breathe in and out, relax more the forehead, the eyebrows, the corners of the mouth, muscles behind the knees, the heels. If we can remind ourselves throughout the day, check ourselves whether those points are relaxed, we can enjoy better health. Also, let's try to sit slightly forward, and we'll do a little exercise stretching the spine. So if you push your neck up, really stretch your spine, just push your head up as if you're stretching the neck. Push as far as you can. And then tilt your head back in a stretch position, arc the back, count 21 in silence. And then relax. Allow the muscles to relax along the spine. We do this once more. First, stretch the spine, push your head up, stretch the neck, and then arc. And straighten the spine again. I'll do it one more time. Stretch your spine, push your head up as far as you can, and arc your spine. And relax. Feel your spine being supported at the base. So your spine is straight and relaxed. Because the spine is really our energy highway system. So if you keep the spine relaxed and straight, usually you'll have more energy. That little stretching exercise you can do, sometimes when you're feeling a little bit tired, you can do a little stretching and you feel more fresh. And you might notice that everything seems brighter. You're getting more oxygen into the brain. So tonight, I'd like to introduce a concept of looking at sickness in health, in particular cancer. And before I go into it, I just want to kind of tell you a little story. Because I think to be human, the most important thing is to have an open mind. Because we are constantly learning new things. The society as a whole is constantly learning new things. So in order to grow, to expand, we have to have an open mind. But yet in the history of science, there are many incidents of cases where there's not an open mind. I think the most famous case has to do with Galileo. More than 350 years ago, Galileo invented a telescope. And through his telescope, he gathered information that contradicted the existing thoughts at that time. Because the existing thought in those days was the earth was the center of the universe. The sun revolved around the earth. Through his telescope, he gathered information that demonstrated that actually the earth revolved around the sun. But since it went against the prevailing idea, especially the teaching of the church, he was forbidden to publish his work. And none of his colleagues would look through his telescope. And until he died, his work was not published. And it's only last November the church formally removed his crime, removed the fact that he was branded as a heretic. So it took 350 years. So I use that as an illustration that in every period in history, the prevailing thoughts may not be true, and that it's important for us to always have an open mind, to always learn new things, to be willing to change our existing ideas about things when new information arrives. And when we're looking at, say in the case of prevention and treatment of cancer, I think in particular we need to have an open mind. And I think I will explain the theoretical basis in which that will look at cancer or look at any disease. The present, I guess the popular thoughts on cancer is that it's viewed as cells growing out of control. That's a definition of cancer, cells growing out of control. And the causes could be chemical, could be dietary, in the very rare cases genetic, but in general having to do with our environment. So this is right now
general idea. And in the treatment of cancer, the mainstream approach is surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. This is a prevailing thought. Yet, if you look at the report given by the Harvard School of Public Health a few years back, I think it was about 6 or 7 years back, the conclusion of the report was that over the last 50 years, most of the advances, it comes from prevention, not from treatment. And that for most type of cancer, over the last 50 years, the 5-year survival rate have not improved much. In some cases, actually deteriorated. So the conclusion of the report is that the best way to deal with cancer was prevention. The emphasis should be on prevention. And in the treatment area, it encouraged looking in new ways of treating cancer. So this is the fact that over the last 50 years, the treatment of cancer, despite billions of dollars, because in America, ever since President Nixon declared war on cancer, there's been billions spent on cancer research. There have been many talented scientists doing research in cancer. There have been many very fancy machines used for cancer research. Why is it after all these efforts, the total, result of cancer treatment has been very little progress? The conclusion, one have to draw, is that there's some error in the whole model, in the approach to looking the view about cancer. And essentially the view has been, I would call it, a view based on Newton's physics, more of a view that looking at a specific point, looking at it through the microscope. I would say a microscopic view. And the story I started with, looking through the telescope, has actually more than just, it's also symbolically. There's sometimes when you start to look at through the microscope too much, you know a lot about very little, but you forget about the whole picture. So occasionally you need to look at things through a telescope to see things in its entirety. And so in the view over the last, I would say 100 years, 200 years, has been increasingly more defining a lot about very little, but yet losing sight of the whole. And that's really, I would blame this on Newton, more on Newton's physics, more the mechanical view. And yet in physics and chemistry, since the beginning of this century, it's been found that Newton's physics was not sufficient to explain the phenomena that one observed, that they had to introduce quantum theory, quantum physics. And even in 1940, Dr. Albert Szent-Györgyi, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering vitamin C, he urged that biology must enter into the phase of quantum theory. And it's been 50 years since he urged biology to enter quantum field theory, to include quantum field theory. I would say it's been very little done in that area, because even just before he passed away a few years ago, in his 90s, because I have done some collaborative work with him, so I'm quite familiar with his thoughts. I know that his view, using quantum physics to look at cancer, was not accepted. There's a tendency for people to reject what one doesn't understand. It's human nature. And so since in biological studies one doesn't study quantum physics, so naturally one rejects quantum theory. And so it's quite unfortunate that after 50 years, when he first urged that, it has not been done much. So what is the uniqueness of quantum theory? How would that change our view about disease and sickness? First of all, quantum theory look at matter in terms of energy states, that all matters in the universe exist at different energy states. And there's a gap, energy gap, between each state. That's why it's called quanta. Also, the quantum theory is a holistic view. In other words, one single entity, if it's the whole energy state can be affected by the environment of that entity and by any parts of the entity. So in the quantum field theory, you cannot localize an effect. You cannot say, well, this part remains local, because any change in the environment, say for example a molecule, if you have any change in the environment of a molecule, it will change the entire energy state. So that's a contribution or the viewpoint of quantum theory. So based on quantum, if we use quantum theory as a metaphor, and I use the word metaphor because to do exact calculation at this point, one can only do it for simple molecules, simple systems. If we're going to look at biological systems, the theory is not developed enough to do an exact calculation. So we can use it only as a philosophical base, as a metaphor. We can use that to look at health and disease as existing at different energy states. That health is existing at a higher energy state, and disease is existing at a lower energy state, and death is the lowest. So with the quantum field theory, first of all, you would look at a person. You can look at a person existing at different, whatever the activity of the person, whether it lowers energy or raises energy, the person's physical body will be shifting from a disease state or a healthy state. Because quantum theory is a holistic view, energetically one cannot separate the mind and the body. In the Newton's physics, you would separate the body and the mind. But in quantum field theory, you cannot. Any change, any activity of the person would change the entire energy state. So quantum field theory provides the model for looking at so-called holistically. And I believe this is what we need to understand cancer, prevention and treatment, because it helps explain a lot of phenomena that is it's available, but cannot be explained by the present scientific model. I've been trained in scientific research for a period. I was involved in scientific research for over a period of 17 years. I started quite young. First year in college, I started doing research. And before I graduated from college, I've already published 2 scientific papers. So compared to most people, I have even though I may not be that old, I have quite a long period of experience in research. And I'm taught that the most essential point for a scientist is to have an open mind, to have a curiosity, and also to take a phenomena. If there's a phenomena, one try to explain it, one try to understand it. One doesn't fit theory. Well, one should fit theory to experimental data and not other way around. So if there's a phenomenon, one try to understand it. And if it doesn't fit in one's so-called existing theory, one can't just say, it doesn't fit my theory, therefore it's not true, right? That is not the scientific approach. And the scientific approach is to always have an open mind, to take whatever one observes, try to understand it. And so I have tried to maintain that attitude. And I think it's because of that, my viewpoint on disease and cancer have been quite different from my colleague. Because from the very beginning when I entered cancer research at University of Texas, my only motivation was to find the solution to cancer. I was not interested in becoming a specialist or to be the best in my field. I was interested in finding the answer to cancer. So if it takes me into psychology, I will read up on psychology. In my trip to China in 1981, I was sent by the National Academy of Sciences to study the relationship between selenium and esophagus cancer. Was by chance I encountered Qigong. And I would say perhaps there were other scientists that went to China and saw such phenomena. They would probably say, oh, Chinese exercise. Right? But for me, it raised a lot of interest because I noticed that cancer patients were going out there doing the Qigong exercise. And after I talked to them, I find out that they actually benefit from it. So that really perked my interest, and I start to study it myself. So that's how, through this process, over the 10-year period that I evolved, I start to have my own view about cancer. And it's a view that developed with time, and my understanding is that cancer is a very complex disease. The causes are many. The physical causes are only one facet of it. There are also emotional as well as spiritual causes. And at the same time, when one is trying to help someone with cancer, one has to approach it from the physical level, emotional level, and spiritual level. So it's been my experience. It was a process of growth going over the period of 10 years when I was working at MD Anderson. And it got to the point in 1987 when I feel I have finally understood the problem, at least in the so-called theoretical way. I left MD Anderson because it was no use trying to find a solution in the laboratory anymore, because the solution did not exist in the laboratory, but rather, to a large extent, exists in our mind, in understanding how our mind works. So I left Anderson, went to the Himalayas, and spent a period of 3 years, where it was 6 months of time I was in India, studying really what I call the sciences of the mind, understanding how the mind works. So what I'll be sharing with you tonight is really a summary, a totality of this experience. So it's going to be quite different from the existing view. And I'm explaining that because my motivation from the very beginning was trying to find a solution to cancer, I was willing to go into a different field because cancer is a very complex disease. And it requires a multi-approach. I don't think one will ever find a simple solution, like a quick fix. If it can be fixed by a one drug or a simple so-called quick fix, we would have found it by now. So why is it over the 50-year period of intense research we have not found a simple solution? It's because it is a complex disease. Human beings are complex, and we have to deal with the whole person. Part of the impact of Newton's physics was, as I said, to look at things in parts. So when a patient walks into a doctor's office, the doctor usually sees only the disease and not the person. And I think we need to now look at the person that has the disease, and treat the person. And so that's the focus that I have learned is where it needs to be put. So if we use the quantum field theory as a base, if we look at disease as a lower energy state, then we're able to appreciate so-called these natural approaches to the treatment of cancer. Whether it's dietary approach, whether it's relaxation, meditation, yoga, emotional support, so-called psychological group therapy, or spiritual practices, we would come to realize that all of these practices have one thing in common. They help raise the energy of a person. So let's say, take diet as an example. In US and also in Europe, there's some popular dietary therapies for the treatment of cancer. Some are based on raw vegetables and fruits. Others are based on cooked vegetables and fruits. But all of them are based on plant products. I have not heard of any cancer dietary therapy that involves red meat or chicken or fish. All of them rely on vegetables, because vegetables are relatively easy to digest. They don't require so much energy to digest. So in terms of the total impact on our energy system, our energy state, it would raise our energy state. Because on the other hand, if we eat a lot of high protein or high fat diet, it requires a lot of energy to digest. And so this model doesn't conflict with what we do know about what causes cancer and how to prevent it, because the general recommendation now given by the National Cancer Institute in the U.S. is to consume more fresh vegetables, fruits, whole grains, to reduce fat intake, to avoid so-called salted and cured food, to avoid smoking and alcohol, taking alcohol, and also to avoid the so-called contamination in the food processing procedure. So it doesn't conflict with that, because what it's saying that fruits and vegetables, whole grains, they are easy to digest. Also in plants, there are a lot of protective factors, such as plant hormones, vitamin A, E, C, selenium. There's a lot of protective factors. Also, the whole grains have fiber, minerals. But from an energetic point of view, they're much easier to digest. One of the used to be popular weight loss program was the consumption of high protein food, such as meat. The fact that you will lose weight itself means it requires energy, right? To digest the lean meat requires energy. That's why you lose weight. So when we talk about energy state, it's very different from calorie as such. Because if it's calorie, we should eat more sugar. But we're talking about its impact on our own energy state. So when we look at diet, we can understand why all these so-called anti-cancer diet are plant-based. There's another scientific base for that, and that has to do with sodium and potassium. And as it turned out, that the modern diet is too high in sodium. In the U.S. anyway, the consumption of potassium to sodium, the ratio is about 0.5, while our body constitution is the reverse. Potassium to sodium is about 2.1 approximately. So the intake of our food is not in the same proportion as what the body needs. And so that's one example that is eternal. Only plants concentrate potassium, especially fruits. Fruits of all kinds, including vegetable fruits such as squash, pumpkins, and grains. They're very high in potassium. And so that's one of the scientific basis for recommending a so-called plant-based food for people with cancer. In my own research, I have demonstrated that if you grow cancer cells in high potassium medium, the cells revert to normal cells. If the potassium level is about 10 times that of normal level. These work have been published in scientific journals over the period 1985-86. So if you're interested, just look under citation index in the library, look under my name, you'll find these papers. So that's proving that indeed, first of all, cancer is reversible, right? If you think of it as irreversible, you will try to cut it out, try to kill it. But if you look in terms of energetically, the energy state model I just mentioned, if you can raise the energy state of a cell or a person, you can shift it from a disease state to a healthy state. So the fact that cancer cells can be reverted to a normal cell proves that it's a reversible process. And when the paper came out, it surprised a lot of people because, but actually a lot of the new research now is in this area, looking for biological factors that can cause cancer cells to revert to normal cells. So it's a very exciting new field. But I think our diet provides some of these things, such as potassium. So this is looking at, say, the dietary aspect. If you look with this model, you'll start to understand why Qigong would help people with cancer. When I was in Beijing, I would talk to these cancer patients, and if they do Qigong, they don't usually, if they're undergoing chemo, they don't lose hair, they don't lose weight, and they don't lose their appetite and also their spirit. So I also talked to the doctors and nurses who took care of these patients, and they also agree that it seems that those who sneak out in the morning to do Qigong do much better. So if you try to look at it from the existing medical model, it doesn't make any sense, right? Why is it doing some special kind of breathing and certain relaxation movement, walking, or why is it that can shrink tumor? Because I've met individuals who have had their tumor shrunk through Qigong. And in China, they have collected quite a few thousands of cases. But if you look at from the energetic model, when people do Qigong, they feel better and raise their energy level. They're actually more spirited. And so And so that would explain why they can shift from a disease state to a healthy state, even though it doesn't directly treat the disease. It doesn't treat specifically the cancer by any means, right? So one can only appreciate it from the quantum model, but not from Newton's physics. And one can also understand from this viewpoint why exercises such as yoga would be beneficial, because it also helps one relax. When we are tense, we tend to dissipate energy. But if we stay relaxed, we can so-called stop the leak. And at the mental level, emotional level, one can start to appreciate why meditation will be beneficial for people with cancer, and also for prevention of cancer, because our thoughts are a major leak of energy. I think all of you have the experience that you need to sleep in the evening, at night, in order for the thoughts to rest, right? For the thoughts to stop, for the body to rest. And so our thoughts usually are very, very busy. We don't notice it normally, but if we try to focus on our breath, say for 1 minute, and try to only do that. Let's try that, okay? See if you can just focus on your breath, in and out. Are you able to focus only on your breath? Or your mind is thinking about something that happened in the past, or there's something that's going to happen in the future? Okay? It's only when we try to ask the mind to do one thing, such as focusing on the breath, we'll start to notice how busy it is. Yet it's always this busy. Right? It's always constantly thinking about things of the past and things of the future. That dissipates a lot of energy. So we can start to train the mind just to stay in the moment. Say, starting with watching the breath. Just train the mind just to be in the moment. We'll find that our working capacity is greater. We're more efficient. And also we're more energetic. We have more energy. We'll be needing less sleep. Those people who have had experience doing longer-term meditation, such as Vipassana meditation, these 10-day courses, or some other meditation practice, is something they'll notice they have more energy. So that just shows that the mind is usually one of the major leak of energy. And we're not even discussing so-called emotional upsets, anger, and other of these so-called most emotional ups and downs. That definitely takes a lot of energy. I'm sure you had the experience that when you cry very hard, when you got very upset and cried or got very angry, you feel very tired afterwards, very exhausted afterwards. If you suffer from a major loss, such a loss of a close friend or a family member, you feel very tired, very weak. So those strong emotions also dissipates a lot of energy. That's why the Chinese medical tradition over years, thousands of years, have recommended equanimity as an essential point in maintaining health. Simply because strong emotions, whether it's anger or fear, they dissipate energy. So watching the breath is a beginning, a way to train the mind to stay in the moment. And also with the relaxation we just went through, relaxing the eyebrows, the corners of the mouth, is also good training in keeping the mind and emotions relaxed. So if you have your corners of your mouth uplifted and you're faced with a situation that normally would get you very angry, you find it very difficult to get angry. So there are techniques to help one. And so this, at least scientifically, we can start to appreciate why meditation would help people with cancer for both prevention and treatment, because it stops one of the major leak of our energy. And then I said, at an emotional level, if there are emotional traumas that we experience, conflicts, that causes a lot of loss of energy. If there are people that we can't forgive, Every time we think of the person, we lose energy. So from this point of view, there are a lot of practice that one can do to help heal those wounds, emotional wounds. And I want to quote one of the work done in Germany, Dr. R.G. Hammer. Over the period since 1979, he collected over 10,000 cases, demonstrating that the onset of cancer is usually triggered by a conflict or a shock, combined with the inability to speak about it or no one will listen. And that shock or conflict first produced a lesion in the brain, and he has the CT scan to demonstrate that. And usually maybe a few months later, then depending on the nature of the shock or conflict, cancer will appear in different parts of the body. And his discovery came upon his own tragedy, because in 1979 his son was killed in Italy, I think by the mafias. Both he and his wife came down with cancer after a very short period. He happens to be a cancer doctor, so it changed his view entirely about the so-called the development of cancer, that it can happen much quicker than what is generally thought, and it could be triggered by emotional factor. So in his own case, he tried to heal his own feelings and his own mind, and through that process his cancer was also reversed entirely through psychological, working on his psychology and his emotion. Then he started to question his patients and asked them whether before the disease, 3 months or 6 months before their disease, whether there was some event in their life that caused shock or conflict, and if it's something that they didn't talk about it or couldn't talk about it, or that no one would listen. And he found that to be true in every case. So over the period he documented 10,000 cases. So if you're interested in his work, you can write to his training center in Grenoble, France. The writing is in French or German. Has not been translated to English. At least in the U.S., there's a tendency not to read anything existing in other languages. So if it's not translated to English, no one knows about it. And I just happened to be visiting France when I came upon that material. So to me, I think it's a very significant piece of information in our understanding of what this disease is. By no means the mind is the only thing, but certainly it's a factor we must take into account. Because in Western medical studies now, there's a whole new field called psychoneuroimmunology, demonstrating the connection between the mind and the immune system. And there are individual cases of psychologists working with cancer patients by dealing with their emotions have helped them recover. But as I said, there are usually individual cases. Dr. Hammer's work is the only one I know that includes such a large number. He does a lot of training in Vienna, University of Vienna, because the father of one of the famous surgeons there had cancer, and he helped him recover. So the surgeon there now invites him to train people in Vienna. So this is, I think, for me, is one of the most exciting discoveries, because it helped me understand some of the individual cases I hear about, and also help me understand some of the spiritual practices that have been found to be helpful for cancer patients. So if the onset, the trigger, is emotional or psychological, then if you can help the person resolve that shock or the conflict, of course it can speed up the recovery. So in the work I do, I spend a lot of time helping people deal with that level. And let me just give you an example. I think it was the year before last, we had a person coming to our course who had cancer of the liver cancer. She worked at the aerospace industry in the San Francisco area. And I asked people to kind of recall something that has been very traumatic or a shock or upset, an unpleasant experience in the recent experience, and asked them to paint it, to draw it out, to express it with colors. And I noticed that she had a big black circle with red lines. So I asked her, well, what does that represent? She says, well, this black circle represents my former boss. She's a terrible person. And, she really mistreated everyone. And the red lines shows my anger toward her. So I asked her to recall that experience, that period, and at the same time, breathe in blue light, sky blue light. As it turned out, our mind is very much affected by color and by sound. And so as she breathed in blue is the vibration of unconditional love, also forgiveness. So as she started to recall that experience and breathe in sky blue light, I asked her to draw again her experience. And this time, it was just a few black lines representing that circle, and the red lines became blue. And she says, well, now when I think about it, the person isn't really 100% bad. And I realize that my work is to forgive. That for me to heal, I have to forgive this former boss. So she came back to our place for another course a few weeks later and looked quite different, quite radiant, quite different. So that's an example that very often, that if you help people get in touch with the emotional cause, they will tell you what is it that caused their disease. And so expressing it is already dissipates a lot of that energy. So talking about it is very helpful. Dr. Hammer has trained his people to listen. So at the training center in France, they just accept calls from all over France. People with cancer can call in and tell them all the things that they couldn't tell their husband, their friends, or whatever. And things are too intimate that they couldn't tell anyone. But just by talking about it, expressing it, it helps them recover. So that's talking is one way. So I always recommend to find a good friend. Talk about the things that bother you. If you don't have a good friend, you can talk about it. You can find a big tree. Speak to the tree, right? Or look in the mirror and speak, right? But just by talking about it, somehow release a lot of that energy. Writing about it is another way. One can spend 20 minutes a day just writing about something that has been very traumatic, very upsetting, right? Something that has been very hurtful. Just spend 20 minutes writing about it. You don't have to worry about your grammar or how well you write. Just write as fast as you can. Just keep on writing it. Just add your feelings about it. And do this every day, at least for 4 days. And usually by the 4th day, you start to look at the situation differently. You might have new insights into the problem. This method was actually used to help former executive of Texas Instrument in Dallas to relocate. Texas Instrument, I think, laid off quite a few of their executives a few years back. And one of the psychologists came in, decided to do a study. He divided the executives into 3 groups. One, they were to write about their feelings, just what I just described. The second group was to write about how they're trying to find another job, right? Their efforts in finding a new job. The third group was just writing about their use of time every day. So after 3 months, the rate of the percent of the executive that have found new jobs, in the first group it was 35%. The other 2 groups almost 0. So the conclusion was that when one writes about one's feeling of being laid off, right? Once you get over that, you can start to move on to the next step. You start to have ideas, inspiration to find new jobs. But if you are stuck in the resentment or hurt or whatever it is, you don't move very far, even though you may be actively looking for a job. Okay? Because usually interviewers will sense if you're still very upset or nervous or whatever about your job situation. So that's how it was used for people trying to find a new job. But it's a very useful technique. Just writing. So writing about something that has been very hurtful or traumatic. Another technique that I recommend is to conjure up that memory. So go through your life, say, start with the most recent one. Conjure up the most traumatic experiences, most upsetting experience. Conjure it up. And watch your breath, right? First you breathe, normally you watch your breath, and then you conjure up the experience. If your breaths start to get faster, if your heart starts to tighten up, it shows that you haven't really resolved that memory. It is still an energetic downer. And so it's actually holding your energy down. So that's a clue that needs to be healed. So by conjuring up, and then breathing in blue light, breathe in the sky blue light into that whole experience will help one release it, let it go. If it's a very deep scar, one has to work on it for a period of weeks. If it's not so deep, then it doesn't take so long to do it. So that's one method that has been very helpful for people, especially for people to learn to let go. For example, if boyfriends and girlfriends broke up, right? Usually it's very hard to forget. I had a friend in Houston who was going through that, and she was really having a hard time letting go, even though she knows it's finished. So I suggest, why don't you breathe in the sky blue light, and then send the sky blue light to the individual you're trying to forget. And then after a month, she called me. She says, it really works. It really works. So the blue light somehow also helps one let go. And one can use it to work on situation where one had lost a close friend or close relative. Again, one can think of the deceased person, send the blue light. And somehow one can come to the point of loving without pain, because unconditional love never brings suffering. It's the conditioned love that brings pain. So through that, one can help resolve a lot of human conflicts, human difficulties. One can use it at places of work, in families, at home. I have even taught scientists to use it in meetings, because as I mentioned, Dr. Albers and Georgi's work in the past have always encountered a lot of resistance. So his colleagues, two physicists, usually have a hard time presenting their paper. So at this particular meeting, I was present. So I suggest, why don't you fill the whole room with sky blue light? Right? Fill the whole room with sky blue light. And then they gave their paper. And they were amazed at people's response, because in the past they would get attacked, right? But this time people were raising their hands and being very helpful, making all kinds of very helpful, positive suggestions. So they're absolutely amazed. So that's the power of love. And because we have our own definition of love, and sometimes it's really conditioned love. But when you work with color, with the vibration, it will get its message across. And so that's something I would share with all of you. It has worked for many others, and you can try it. And to work on healing, whether it's troubling relationship or troubling experiences, use that to heal that. And that will help in getting rid of the energetic leak in the emotional level. So that's quickly going over so-called the physical, emotional. And then we'll just touch briefly on the spiritual level in terms of what we mean, in terms of how does one raise one's energy at that level. As it turns out, the more compassionate one is, the more one can love and be concerned of others, the higher one's energy. If one is selfish, self-centered, you can almost see it in your mind, it contracts, right? It contracts and lowers the energy. So what is spiritual development? Really, what is spiritual? It's really our ability to love, ability to care. And regardless what spiritual tradition you come from, the essential point of all spiritual practices is to develop a good heart. And that's why Land Medicine Buddha has a very funny name, a Center for Healing and Developing a Good Heart, because healing and good heart really go hand in hand. They go together. So in one's spiritual development, the most essential point is to open one's heart, to develop one's heart, to have a good heart, to love beyond one's own narrow circle of families and friends. Because usually we care only for those who are close to us, and we don't care for strangers. And so, but yet if we understand what is it that brings us happiness, we'll find that when we're faced with those we love, we're very happy. I mean, it's an experience that we all have. If we see our children, we're very happy. We see our loved ones, we're very happy. But if we can increase the circle of those we love, naturally we are happier more often. And so we start to see that everyone that we meet are someone that's dear to us, and start to really care for them. Then it doesn't matter where we go, wherever we are, we will be happy, because happiness raises energy. I'm sure one has the experience that if you're having a conversation with a good friend, you'll be very energetic, right? But if you're meeting with someone that you dislike very much, the longer you talk, the more tired you are. So this is our experience, right? So how to transform those energy-leaking relationships, right? It has to do with opening our heart, trying to see that to be able to love more than only those who are close to us. So that's one aspect of looking at the spiritual level. Then there's another aspect, which is looking beyond the present life. Our sense of time usually is limited to our own birth and death. This is our reality. But actually a lot of people have other experiences, that the time span of our existence actually goes beyond this lifetime. Actually, we have lived and died many, many times. And this comes up in past life regression. This comes up in meditation. And so people from different parts of the world have had this kind of experience. And also it comes up with children who remember their past lives. Dr. Ian Stevenson, University of Virginia, is a scientist that especially studied this. He has a book out called Children Remembering Their Past Lives. And he finds that those who die of an accidental death, when they are born again, they remember their past. So he has documented cases throughout the world. Rather fascinating, because they can be confirmed, the original parents and the exact situation. So as I say, also through past life therapy now, there's a new field in psychology. People get in touch with the traumas of the past. Dr. Ian Stevenson have noticed that people who are born with certain illness very often die with it. Like, for example, a baby born with asthma, and he has some studies showing that they die of asthma. And he was going to publish his next book, and I've been patiently waiting. I think it might be out. I haven't checked. But a few years back when I asked him, he says that's the next book, more of a medical aspect of reincarnation. And he has police documentations and different things. So that's a phenomenon that we have to look at. Remember what I was saying earlier. A scientist must have an open mind. A scientist look at a phenomena and say, well, let's try to understand it. Instead of saying, well, instead of saying, it doesn't fit my theory, so it doesn't exist. Right? The theory has to fit the data. So the data is such that there is such a phenomenon. Now, there's been a few very popular books published in the U.S. in this area. One is by Brian Weiss. He's a medical doctor, a psychiatrist. He discovered by chance that his patient had other lifetimes. This was quite a few years ago when he was at the University of Miami psychiatric department. He was the head of the department. And he had a patient who had all kinds of sickness, very strange symptoms. And he tried different things and nothing seemed to help. He thought maybe he might try hypnosis and try to find out the source of her problem. And he would regress her to her childhood and earlier and birth time. But nothing seemed to affect her symptoms. So one day he just got a little bit tired and said, go back to the origin of your disease. And this lady went back 4,000 years and described the situation that happened then that involved her sense of choking, for example. And the interesting thing is after that she started to get better. And he would meet her every week and take her back to different lifetimes because she had many, many problems. And so every year, period of 1 year or so, she got much, much better. So he had all these tapes. He kept them for 4 years, not knowing what to do with them, because he was afraid of his reputation being ruined if he publicized this information. But at the same time, he felt compelled to share this with the public. So he published his book called Many Lives, Many Masters, became a bestseller. Also, he received many letters from psychologists who said, we observe the same phenomena in our practice, but we haven't had the courage to write about it. So it's a phenomena that we have lived in the past. And so our diseases, the cause, may have its origin in other lifetimes. So if you're dealing with a disease of that nature, whatever you do dealing in this time space is not going to do much. You have to get to the root cause of it. And so through past life therapy or past life regression, people have helped get over some of their problems. One man had a back problem for many years. Nothing seemed to help. So Dr. Weiss regressed him, and he remembered the time when he was killed in the back, and he fell over and drowned in the water below. So after he recalled that situation, his back pain went away, disappeared. So he had many, many cases. He has a second book out now since that book. So if you're interested, you should look for it. Dr. Brian Weiss, MD, W-E-I-S-S. So there's also another book called Past Life Therapy, written by a psychologist, which dates further back, maybe over 10 years ago. And he has many cases. One in particular I remember very well involved a lady who, after she got married, developed cancer of the uterus. She didn't want surgery, so she went to see this doctor and tried to find out if she can get rid of it through other means. And through hypnosis, she went to her last death, and turned out she had died after giving birth to 10 children, died in childbirth. And her uterus was in a very bad shape. And so the doctor took her back again and again to that death scene until all that emotion was released. And her cancer also regressed and disappeared. Because in her mind, she associated marriage with having children with death. So our mind is a very powerful thing. And I feel this is a frontier in medicine, a frontier in science. How the mind works, how it creates its own reality, and by getting to working with its so-called language or working with its law, we can resolve a lot of very complex things. Well, just to give you an example, in the U.S. there's a popular thing about firewalking. People walk over heated coal, right, about 10 or 12 feet, without any adverse reaction. And usually people train for maybe 4 hours before they do that. So when they walk over the hot coal, they think, cool moss, cool moss, cool moss. Right? If they get only time people get hurt is when they got distracted. Maybe a flashlight went off, they got distracted, then they end up with a burn. But see, in medical studies, the thing that they usually try to eliminate is placebo effect, right? They think it's something that interferes with the study, because very often a drug will have a placebo effect. Maybe a third of it will respond to it, even if it's a sugar pill. But if you tell them that this will cure your disease, they'll get well, right? Usually a third of people. And usually that's discarded, right? It's an interference. But my feeling is we should really study this placebo effect and try to maximize it. Right? If by simply training the mind to think of cool moss, you can walk over hot coal and change the reaction of the skin to the heat, that's very powerful. Why not train it for healing, for health, right? For dissolving tumors? Doctors Carl Simonton and Stephanie Simonton quite a few years ago have done studies showing that with lung cancer patients, if you teach them also to visualize the cancer cells being attacked by white blood cells and visualize the cancer cells disappearing, that their recovery rate was twice that of national average. So that shows our mind is very powerful, that it can create disease as well as heal. And so the power of visualization is something that we need to look into. In speaking on such, we're looking at, I was talking about past lives, and right in this process, mentioning about past the power of the mind. That in visualization, for example, with cancer, one of the very good color to work with is gold. Just like gold, right? 18 karat gold, or pure gold. Gold light. That when you visualize gold light coming in, it stimulates the immune system, immune response. So let's do a little visualization. So if you just relax again, keep your spine relaxed but straight. Visualize a golden sun above your head, as bright as you can visualize it. It's an early morning golden sun, liquid gold. Allow the sun to come into your head and fills your head with gold light. Allow the sun to descend further to your throat area. To your heart. Radiating down your arms, so every single cell is illuminated in this golden light. Allow the golden sun to come to your heart, your stomach, pelvic area, the legs, the knees, the feet. See every single cell in your body filled with this golden light, every organ filled with golden light, as bright as you can see it. Allow this golden sun to come back, making each cell even brighter on its way back, up the legs, the knees, the pelvic area, the heart, the throat, the head, goes out your head. Now we'll do a little humming and allow this golden light to vibrate, really vibrate the cells. Okay, just feel the vibration of this golden light. Hum. So what you just learned is a visualization that helps stimulate the immune system. So it's something very good for people with a lower immune system, whether it's AIDS or cancer or a common cold. That you can visualize the golden sun coming in, illuminating every part of your body, filling it and making it as bright as possible. So what I have just went through is a kind of just an overview, the concept of looking at health and disease from the point of view of quantum theory, in terms of energies, in terms of energy state, and in terms of a way to appreciate so-called all these existing modalities, whether it's 5,000 years old or 50 years old. Right? Looking at, we can look, because a lot of these ancient techniques really can be only appreciated through quantum theory. They cannot be explained through Newton's physics. And because of that, one cannot say it's not scientific. I mean, it's not scientific, it doesn't fit the Newton's model, Newton's physics model, but it can only be explained through quantum theory. Let's take a look at, say, Chinese medicine. In China, it's practiced side by side with Western medicine. And when I was in China in Beijing, I met a Chinese medical doctor who was a fourth generation medical doctor. And I had a chance to study with him. And I keep on asking him, because he had a lot of experience treating cancer using herbs. And I keep on asking him, well, why can't you do clinical studies with these Chinese herbs? If it's this good in treating cancer, why can't you do some clinical study? And he would correct me saying, we treat the individual. So maybe this medicine is good for this person. It may not be good for the next person with the same disease. Superficially, they may both have stomach cancer, right? But they have two very different constitutions. The causes could be different. So in helping the person, you would use different herbs. So I asked him several times until I finally got it, that the Chinese medical model really is oriented toward the individual, looking at the individual person. So even though certain herbs work on helping a person, if you take that in a clinical study, it doesn't work because it goes against what the medical model is, the Chinese medical model, because it really treats the individual. You cannot take something and test it. And so for that reason, it has always been criticized, right? It's being not scientific. One can try to understand why is it there's such a difference between East and West, right? Not just in medicine, but generally the whole culture is very different. And one can appreciate now more by understanding how the brain works. As it turned out, we have two hemispheres, a right side and a left side, and they operate quite differently. The right side is much more intuitive, holistic, spiritual, artistic. It's very much interested into relationship, but not interested in details. The left side is more logical, more egotistical, and interested in detail. It's more scientific. So the mind, the brain, actually has two different parts of it, working quite differently. In the East, whether it's a language, perhaps it's more the language, let's say the Chinese language, for example, they're evolved from pictures, they're pictorial. And so they stimulate more of the right brain, because art is very much a right brain function. And so the Chinese civilization, as well as the Indian civilization, very much a right brain civilization. So in both civilizations, there's a vast wealth of the arts, the poetry, and so-called the literary thing. It's very, very rich. As far as scientific progress is concerned, even though there are some great scientists in history that developed, say, gunpowder or printing press, the rest of society was not interested in following it up, because it was a very much a right-brain society. In the West, on the other hand, the language is alphabetical. So it's stimulates more of the left brain. And so it's much more logic-oriented. So science flourished in the West. So that's one of the major fundamental difference between East and West. So Kipling did say, East is East, West is West, the two shall never meet. Because if you try to communicate right brain with left brain, without trying to cross over, it's very difficult. It's like you cannot communicate with someone who speaks a different language by learning more about your own language, right? You have to be willing to step over, learn the other language, then you can communicate. So same thing between the East and West. So that in the East, the medical system that's a product of that right brain is very different from the Western medical system that's a product of the left brain. Right? So if you try to fit the right brain model, the medical model, into the left brain medical model, it doesn't work. Because from the left brain, looking at the right brain, says it's not scientific. It doesn't make any sense at all. And the right brain is very frustrated because they can't explain to the left brain why it's different. But it's just different. It's like someone who's an artist. An artist cannot explain his inspiration, right? Why he paints in a certain way. The same thing, we cannot explain why we fall in love. It's not a logical process, right? It's a feeling, it's an experience. Same thing when we enjoy a sunset, or we enjoy the stars, or we have an inspiration, a religious, spiritual experience. That can never be explained logically. It's an experience, it's a feeling. Oh, sometimes we have an intuitive feeling. We feel something is going to happen. We just know. We cannot explain why. So it's a different process. So we have to recognize we have two parts of our brain, right side and left side. What we need to do is learn to use both sides of our brain. Because I feel the problems we face these days, not just medical problems, cancer is only one of it, but all the problems we're faced with these days in the world needs to be approached with two sides of our brain. Because anything that can be solved where only one side has been solved, whether it's left or right side, right? The challenge now is to work with two sides of the brain. So same thing when we're looking at the problem of cancer, we have to approach it from two sides of our brain, the intuitive side as well as the logical side. And in the medical system, we need to take advantage of the strength of, say, the Chinese medical model as well as the strength of the Western medical model. It's not like one is right, the other is wrong. It's not like that. Each have its own specialty, its own place in contribution to our health. But if one starts to appreciate the differences, then one can start to talk, right? One can start to communicate. So in the Chinese medical model, it's very much interested in the interconnection of the different parts of the body. And the Chinese medical model is interested in the interconnection between mind and the body. It talks very much about the different emotions and how it affects the different energy system, such as anger affecting the liver, fear affecting the kidney, the joy affecting the heart, obsessive thinking affecting the spleen, and sadness affecting the lung. That's the Chinese medical model. Very much interested in that. And sometimes we understand that as help understand some of the findings, new findings, because in the Western medical studies they found that women who get breast cancer tend to have a difficulty expressing anger, whether it's overexpression or repression. And if you look at the energetic pattern or meridian of the liver, because anger is associated with liver, it terminates at the breast. So the breast is part of the liver energetic system. So it makes sense that if you have problem imbalance and expression of anger, upsets the energy of the liver meridian, which terminates in the breast. And so one can start to understand why we're observing these phenomena. For a medical system to survive thousands of years, it must have its value. Otherwise, it would never survive thousands of years. And just because we cannot explain it in a medical or a scientific model that only developed in the last few hundred years, we can't say it's now scientific. It's just that we still have to find a better system, a better model to explain it. So now we can use quantum theory to appreciate Chinese medical model because it's holistic. It's very much interested in the whole person. And as I said, it's interested in realizing that an imbalance in one part of the body is going to affect another part of the body. So you never treat just the symptom. You try to get to the root cause. And so from an energetic point of view, say the liver system affects the sight, the eyes, right? The kidney system affects the hearing, the ears, and the heart, the tongue. So different parts of the body affects different parts. So if you have ringing in the ears, if you don't go to an ear specialist, you may not find much solution, much relief. But if you go to the origin, which is the kidney, and try to stimulate the circulation in the kidney, such as applying ginger compress, the ringing stops. You know, by applying it for 30 minutes, say grate a handful of ginger, boil it for 15 minutes, and dip a cloth in it, and apply it in the kidney area for 30 minutes. For some people, one time stops the ringing. For other people, you might have to try a few more times. So that's something that people have found to be very helpful. So we need to appreciate more the interconnection between the different parts of the body, and appreciate more the interconnection between every facet of the society and our action to recognize that it has an impact on the whole. And why are we having such crisis environmental issues? Why are we having a big hole in ozone layer? Why are we having such serious water pollution, air pollution, right? It's really the problem of looking at just one part, right? Not looking at the impact of everything we do, whether it's the way we eat, have an impact on the whole. So let's look at the way we eat. How does it have an impact on our earth, right? as it turned out, most of the damage, the cause of the cutting down the rainforest, most of the depletion of the topsoil and the water pollution, it comes to the fact that we consume a lot of meat, because it takes usually over 10 pounds of grains. Say for beef, it takes 16 to 20 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of beef. To support a meat eater, it takes 6 times more land. So to have more land, you have to cut down more forests. Right? That in turn caused the carbon dioxide level to raise in our atmosphere. Over the last, I think, 25 years, it's raised at least 20% carbon dioxide. So there's less oxygen around, proportion-wise. And so we have to start to recognize that everything we do have an impact on the society and on the earth, and start to see everything as a whole, because the earth is our home. It's the only home we have. We don't have a second home. We can't move to the moon if this gets trashed. Okay? So we need this whole view. So when we talk about health, we have to go beyond the individual health. We have to start to look in terms of the health of the earth. And so everything we do in different countries have impact on people living in other countries. It's like, cutting down a rainforest in South America would impact people in Singapore, right? The hole in the ozone layer. It's going to affect all of us. So that's what I mean by the right brain and the left brain working together, and really start to try to see things in a wholeness, and really understanding that we don't have a choice when we talk about environmental protection. It's not just big talk. We don't have a choice. It's a very practical thing. We have only one home, and that's our earth. If we don't take care of it now, we won't have a home to live on. And when we destroy the earth, we destroy ourselves. So when we talk about individual health, everything that's beneficial for us at an individual level will also benefit the earth. We talked earlier about the importance of the plants, right? Living on plant food. That's also beneficial for the earth, because we need much less land, and it creates much less pollution, and use much less water. I don't know if Singapore has a water problem. To produce 1 pound of beef, the amount of water that's needed, at least in California, for example, in producing beef, the amount of water that's needed to produce 1 pound of beef is equivalent to a person taking a shower for the whole year.